Hello, my name is Joshua Long, and I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell in the School of Criminology and Justice Studies. And I study child safety, crimes against children. And one person who has been very popular lately after writing the book, The Coddling of the American Mind and the Anxious Generation, and he's been on many podcasts, including Joe Rogan, Oprah, is Jonathan Haidt. And I want to show with data, with statistics, why his depiction of child safety is wrong. So, to begin with, Jonathan Haidt is a professor of ethical leadership at the New York University School of Business. And he has done a lot of things in his life. Throughout his career, he's talked about he's been a big proponent of moral foundations theory, that people have different taste buds and ideological biases that stop them from being able to effectively communicate with others and learn how they might be wrong. He's promoted Stoic philosophy. He's co-founded the Heterodox Academy to try to get people to talk across the political divides. He wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, another one, The Righteous Mind. And lately, he's been focusing on the effects that social media and screen time has on adolescent mental health. He's very popular, and to tell the truth, just to get this out of the way now, I read The Righteous Mind and I thought moral foundations theory had a lot of value. So I personally conducted two surveys with Moral Foundations questionnaire following in Haidt's work to see people's reaction to different criminal punishments. And I surveyed over 800 people, so I don't have an axe to grind against the man personally. I started off thinking that his work was valuable, but his mistakes that he makes in regards to child safety are so egregious that I no longer trust his scholarship. I think he's extremely sloppy, and I can't read his mind. I don't know why he is so wrong about child safety, but I can show you in this video many ways that he says something, writes something, and it has no basis in reality. Here is a summary of Haidt's beliefs about child safety, which he discussed on the Joe Rogan show. He said that we overprotect children in the real world, and adults are therefore restricting children's independence, their risk-taking, and unsupervised play. He thinks that that makes kids weak and soft. He thinks if we let them outside more, they would build resilience because they would, um, fall out of a treehouse and break their arm. And that if he laments that the number of broken bones in emergency rooms has decreased over time because that means children aren't taking as many risks. And that's a pretty good parallel argument for his belief about children being the victims of crime, where he says, well, the crime rate plummeted when we started supervising children. Therefore, that's bad because that means children are not taking risks and learning from those risks. He also argues that we don't protect children enough on the internet. He thinks children are given access to the internet, it's not supervised or regulated, and that social media can cause anxiety. And I would tend to agree with that. I'm a parent, and I take that pretty seriously, but it doesn't necessarily comport with his inaccurate views on overprotection in the real world. I would also say that his position on the dangers of the internet and social media is exaggerated because, like I said, he's a very sloppy researcher, and he many times says that correlation is causation. He misunderstands the basic fundamental research methodology in the social sciences and the limits of that research. He cherry picks studies that he likes and ignores studies he doesn't. And so even though I'm on his side with that, you should supervise your children, I think he's an extremist in that sense. And when you combine these two together, he says that we should stop giving our kids screens and let them play outside, even if there are risks outside, which he doesn't think there are very many risks. And that's kind of a problem. I'm going to play a short clip from the Joe Rogan Experience where he can say in his own words a summary of what he's written in his books.
Childhood predators are real.
Not really, not anymore. What I mean is...
What do you mean?
Well, when you and I were growing up, there were childhood predators out there in the physical world approaching children. And I think you said there, you told the story about one who approached you when you were doing magic tricks. So there were child predators out there. That's true. They're all on Instagram now.
Yeah.
The kids aren't out, and Instagram, and especially Instagram, makes it super easy for them to get in touch with children.
Yes.
So so this is my point. I can summarize the whole book with a single sentence. We have overprotected our kids in the real world and underprotected them online.
I would agree to that.
So that, yes, child predators are terrible, but guess what? We actually locked up most of them. When you and I were growing up, they weren't all locked up. They were just eccentrics who were exposing themselves. Remember flashers? That doesn't happen anymore, because if you do that now, you're going to jail for a long, long time. So we actually locked up most of the predators, and they know, don't approach kids on a playground, approach them on social media.
I don't know if we are doing that. And there's this new push.
Once you're identified as a sex offender, you'll never, you are gone for a long time. And then there's sex offender. No, we've really done a lot since the 90s to change to make the real world safer.
Now I'm going to summarize why he's wrong. This is what the video is all about. Haidt says that children are safe, but he cherry picks extreme definitions of stranger abductions and kidnappings as his measure of safety. And he ignores all of the other measures of child safety, including 93,176 children sexually abused by total strangers every year. Haidt says that the risk of children spending time with strangers and registered sex offenders is low, while ignoring the low report rates for these types of crimes, which are very traumatizing, and it takes years to disclose what happened, if you disclose at all. He also ignores the disproportionate rate of abuse, considering the fact that he admits that children don't spend much time with strangers anymore. Back in his day, strangers used to discipline children and interact with children and argue with them. Children used to be bullied, and they would learn to either fight back or run away or talk their way out of it, and that makes kids resilient. Now he says they don't interact with strangers, and yet strangers are still committing 10 to 20% of sex crimes against children. So it's disproportionate, and he ignores that entirely. Haidt says that the perverts are all locked up, that we started locking up sex offenders more, and instead of treating them as eccentrics back when he was a kid. And then therefore there's no threat. Well, first off, how do they get locked up? By committing a crime, right? So you have to commit the crime to get locked up. So that doesn't mean the threat is gone. But there might be an incapacitation effect if all sex offenders went to prison. But he doesn't cite any statistics to back up that claim. In fact, almost every study shows that less than 5% of sex crimes result in incarceration at all. So the majority don't get locked up at all. And when they are incarcerated, it's for relatively short terms, which I'll show you some data, the average amount of time people serve for rape, aggravated sexual abuse of a child, and lewd sexual acts with a child molestation. It's very low, very short terms. The sex offender registry has nearly 1 million people on it of convicted sex offenders. And as someone who studies this, I think that there are probably some people on that registry that don't need to be on there anymore. He says that, well, they only commit 5% of the sex crimes, but registered sex offenders make up 0.2% of the population. So when you do the math, that means that a registered sex offender is 25 times more likely to be caught committing a new sex crime than people who aren't on the registry. It doesn't mean that sex offenders are a good bet to spend time with your child unsupervised. It's bizarre logic, in my opinion. And Haidt ignores the trauma of sexual abuse as an adverse childhood experience, which I'll explain with quotes from his book. He argues that adverse childhood experiences can make kids resilient as long as they are not combined with poverty and other adverse experiences. And I consider his dismissal of the extensive research on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, to be almost malpractice. If people took psychologists seriously enough to have a malpractice board, that ignorance of the research would be enough for me to say that he's wrong about all this. So first, one thing that every researcher has to do is operationalize your terms. Like, what are you talking about? Child safety. What does that comprise? What elements of it are you talking about? And then you provide as much data as you can on each one of them. So what he says is kids these days are less likely to have teenage pregnancy, less likely to break their bones, and less likely to drink. Therefore, they're not taking enough risks. And the immediate argument is, do you want those things to go up? You want kids to get drunk and get pregnant and break their bones? And he would weasel his way out of it, I'm sure, with some debate school logic. But the fact is that when he talks about child safety, he does not itemize what he's talking about. He doesn't explain it at all. He doesn't define his terms. He just chose abduction so that he can choose something that he knows is relatively rare, and then he can mock all of your other concerns. So first, we have the adverse childhood experiences literature that lists a series of things that we know are correlated with trauma and poor mental health and medical problems and drug and alcohol abuse and all kinds of other problems in your life. So there's a lot of research on the ACEs I'll talk more about. He summarily dismisses all of those things. He doesn't talk about them at all. He has a couple paragraphs about poverty, that growing up without enough money might cause problems for you, but he doesn't consider that to be worthy of consideration. And then there's accidents. So you could have an accident as a child inside the home or outside of the home. You could have an accident during sports and recreation, and you might get hit by a car. So off the top of my head, I came up with three. I would say, what elements of child safety involve accidents? Well, those things. And as I said before, he suggests that if children have a decrease in the number of broken bones, that's actually bad because that's an indicator they're not spending enough time outside taking risks. So he doesn't think accidents are bad for kids. Delinquent peers. Well, obviously, if your child is unsupervised and hanging around the neighborhood all day, they would be more likely to be able to get into trouble without parental supervision. So that might mean that they're being exposed to drugs and alcohol at younger ages. They might be encouraged to commit crimes, and pretty much the typical stuff that a lot of teenagers get into and children at younger ages are protected from because parents supervise younger kids. Jon Haidt never talks about any of that. Criminal victimization. So this is where the child is a victim of a crime. Bullying and harassment. Jon Haidt is on the record saying that bullying is good for kids because it teaches you to either talk your way out of it, to fight back, or run away. He doesn't talk about broken bones or getting beaten up or anything like that. So that he's dismissive of bullying and harassment of your child. And if your child was the victim of something like that, it wouldn't change his mind. He would say, well, it's kind of like the omelet analogy. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Some kids are going to be bullied and traumatized, and it's necessary for all kids to have to take risks in order to live in a world where they don't use screens too much. Also, children could have their stuff stolen from them. They could be robbed. They could be assaulted, beaten up. And sexual victimization is what I study. And this is what was a red flag for me when I read his book. And I could not believe he didn't bother to cite any statistics on the sexual victimization of children, even by strangers. He just thinks that stranger danger is a funny rhyming term, and he doesn't bother to give any statistics on it or to analyze whether the threat has gone up or down or stayed the same over time. And that ignorance, it shows in all of his work and all of his podcasts. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He just pretends this isn't a problem. He says there are no more predators. They're all locked up. And then there's murder. You could find murder statistics on people under the age of 18 killed in drive-by shootings and stuff. But that is rare. Fortunately, children are very unlikely to be killed in the United States. And if they are killed, it's usually by someone they know, like a family member. So if he wanted to pick murder as an example, that wouldn't be too difficult for him to do. But he chooses kidnapping. And the reason he chooses kidnapping is because it is something that people worry about. And there's been high profile cases of abduction. But because he chooses abduction only as his only measure of child safety to mock and ridicule, he's able to mask the fact that he doesn't know anything about these other things that happen to kids. And then human trafficking, he's also mocked on some podcasts. He's not concerned with that. So here's some statistics, some charts that he copy and pasted and put on his website, letgrow.org. It's a website, it's a nonprofit. It gets over $1 million a year in donations. And he said crime is plummeting. And this is his evidence that crime is plummeting. You'll notice that these charts that he copy and pasted are crimes against adults. These are crimes that include gang members being shot and killed. Well, the number of gang members shot and killed goes up and down, depending on all kinds of issues. Every criminologist studies this. And what does this have to do with kids? Can't he isolate the number of children who were victimized? What does this matter? I'm sure it's parallel in some way, but he could find the data if he wasn't lazy. I don't know why he chooses to report these big nationwide estimates of crime instead of finding specifically the number of crimes against children.
In the 1990s, as the crime rate was plummeting, as American life was getting safer and safer, Americans freaked out and thought that if they take their eyes off their children, the children will be abducted. But it's not until the 1990s that we really start locking kids up.
So my counter argument to this is that crimes against children are not plummeting, especially sexual assault crimes. So the data you see here comes from a series of reports that are put out periodically by the University of New Hampshire's Crimes Against Children Research Center, led by David Finkelhor. And David Finkelhor is a very smart man. He's a very hard worker. I thought about making a video about his career and his work because he does a great job. And he's the one who gets all of the prevalence estimates of kidnapping and sexual assault of children over time. And he's been doing this since 1979. He did a survey of families in Boston, and he asked them, in the past year or lifetime prevalence, were you sexually abused? Were your children sexually abused? And that first study in 1979, which I've put on this chart, found that 19.2% of girls and 8.6% of boys had been sexually assaulted before they turned 18 in Boston. Now, that study wasn't great. David Finkelhor was still working on his methodology, but he got better over time. And that's why I chose to only report his prevalence estimates, not just because he's the best, but because it would show that if there was a decrease, that might be because David Finkelhor got better at doing research over his 40-year career. So in 1997, he found it was 14.5% of girls and 6.5% of boys. It went up in 1999, it went down in 2015, and this up and down is noise, by the way, that it's probably very stable. It's an artifact of our flawed survey methodology. But this is pretty standard. If you were to ask someone, how many girls are sexually abused before they turn 18? They might say, well, 1 in 5 or 1 in 4. So in 2014, which would have been the data available to Jon Haidt when he wrote his book, Coddling the American Mind, he did not cite them. But he could have said 26.6% of girls and 5.1% of boys are sexually abused before they turn 18. But he didn't say that, either because that's a big number or because a lot of sexual abuse happens within family and relationships. And so he just ignored it all. But this survey in 2014 actually measures, it separates people on relationship status. And so it actually includes how many of you were sexually abused by an adult that you didn't know at all, adult strangers. We can separate that out. And then in 2024, the most recent statistics found that it went back to, a pretty close to the middle there, 19.8% and 6.2%. But you see, I have two surveys here. That's actually the same survey. And what they did is they asked the question in two different ways. Have you been sexually assaulted or abused by someone? And then they asked, has it ever happened over the internet? So above and beyond that, the internet has increased the number of kids who are exposed to have been sexually exploited over the internet through chat rooms and social media. That's some statistics that Jon Haidt could have latched onto. He could have said that bolsters his second argument that kids are not safe online. They need supervision. But I wonder if one of the reasons he doesn't talk about that survey is because it also shows that they're still being sexually abused at the same rate now as they were back in 1979. 6.2% of boys and 19.8% of girls. It hasn't plummeted as he claims. So he's wrong about that. And I don't know any other way to say it. I didn't come up with these statistics. This comes from a reliable source, David Finkelhor at the University of New Hampshire. And for Jon Haidt to not know about these surveys and not cite them is frankly embarrassing. I would never write a book that didn't at least try to find the prevalence estimates for these crimes. So I took that survey, the 2014, it was published. I think the data came from 2013, um, from David Finkelhor's study, and I extrapolated it. So instead of talking about percentages, let's get a raw number. How many kids are sexually abused by strangers in the United States every year? Well, if you think that in the year 2014, there were 72 million children estimated to be in the US, that's 36 million girls, 36 million boys. Well, we start doing the math. If 26% of girls are sexually abused by age 17, that would be 563,294 girls per year and 108,000 boys per year sexually abused. If you break it down further to how many were victimized by adults, because that's another issue, obviously there's a lot of issues with that where if an adult is a predator and is seeking out children, we want to know that. But what if they were 17 years old and they were seeking out a 12-year-old? That could also be an issue. That's also a horrifying thing. It doesn't matter that his birthday hasn't come yet. He's not 18 yet. But it does matter in the sense that it's dealt with in the juvenile justice system, not the adult criminal justice system, usually. So that would be 11.2% of girls were victimized by adults, and 1.9% of boys were victimized by adults. So that's still a very large number. You can't summarily dismiss this by saying, oh, well, it's just, boyfriends sexually abusing their girlfriends. That is worthy of concern, by the way. But it doesn't answer the question that we're looking for. 5.5% of girls were victimized by family members, and 0.6% of boys were victimized by family. In a case like this, maybe these kids should be spending more time outside the household to get away from their family members who are victimizing them. But now we can isolate how many were victimized by total strangers, someone you do not know. That's 3% of girls and 1.4% of boys. 63,529 girls per year, 174 girls every day are sexually abused by a total stranger. 29,647 boys per year, 81 per day. Now, notice something interesting about this. Boys are more than twice as likely to be sexually abused by a stranger than a family member. Girls are almost half as likely to be sexually abused by a stranger as a family member. Could it be because we protect girls more than boys, that we have an attitude that boys can play outside and we're not worried about them, whereas girls are not? But even so, girls are twice as likely to be sexually victimized by a stranger than a boy. So think about those numbers. If you think about these numbers right here for 30 seconds, then you're a better parenting expert than Jon Haidt, because he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's never looked at these numbers before. He's never thought about them. He's never incorporated them into his work. It's embarrassing that he calls himself a parenting expert and says you shouldn't worry about safety when 63,000 girls and 29,000 boys are sexually abused by total strangers every year. And then you say, well, what is sexual abuse? And then you start to get into that mindset of dismissing the concern and saying it's not abuse. Well, if you were to look only at rape, that's 6.1% of girls and 0.6% of boys who were raped, forced to have sex. 129,000 girls, 12,706 boys. So the others would fall into the category of child molestation, but I don't like that word. The word molestation is sometimes, it's a legal term in some states, but the word molest means to bother. And I think that's a euphemism for what's actually happening to these kids. Not to mention the fact that when people are charged with the crime of child molestation, they're usually pleading down from something more serious. So here is the actual study I just cited, The Lifetime Prevalence of Child Sexual Abuse and Sexual Assault by David Finkelhor. And then you can go and look this up. I believe it's open access, but if you need information, send me an email. I want to emphasize something. In the surveys, the procedure for the surveys was there is a short interview conducted with an adult caregiver, usually a parent, to obtain the family demographic information. You get permission. Does anybody answer the phone and do a phone interview? And would a parent let them talk to their children? And how many people hung up the phone? And if you did let your child talk on the phone, isn't it very likely that that would be a household where there's not abuse going on? And because the parents who are doing the abusing are aware of it, are probably not going to want to traumatize their kid for a phone interview, then one child per household is chosen. So if multiple children in the household are being sexually abused, only one kid gets counted. the oldest kid. So I consider this survey to have the same limitation lots of surveys do, that it is not completely accurate. But we have to agree that these are low estimates. The way that the bias is indicating is that the actual number would probably be greater. And to emphasize this, think about there's a big debate on whether or not boys are really so unlikely to be sexually abused. We don't really know because boys are less likely to report it than girls. Only 1 out of 4 victims of sexual abuse disclose in childhood at all, and 1 out of 4 never disclose it at all. One study found that men wait an average of 15 years to report being abused. So if they were abused when they're 15, are they going to tell you when they're 17? When they on average wait 15 years? Maybe they're still trying to process this. Maybe they're still full of shame and stigma of the abuse and they don't want to talk about it, especially to a stranger over the phone. So I would say that 108,000 is very likely to be an underestimate, not an overestimate. So with that said, why doesn't Jon Haidt cite that statistic? Well, he has a better statistic, one that suits his purposes even better, and that is kidnapping. He would rather focus on kidnapping because that is more rare than to be recorded by the police than other crimes. And so if you're worried your child will be kidnapped, Jon Haidt can laugh at you. He says roughly 100 children per year in a nation with 70 million minors are kidnapped by strangers. So roughly 100. Well, if it's roughly 100, why doesn't he cite his statistic? Why doesn't he say, I read this study by David Finkelhor, and he said there was 102? Because he's very sloppy. And this is my opinion. I can't read his mind. I don't know. I think he is talking about this because he read it somewhere else. He probably read it in Lenore Skenesi's book or Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And with those two books, what they've done is they're citing someone else. So you cite someone who's citing someone else and you didn't read it yourself. Otherwise, you would cite the original source. But this roughly 100 number is another example of Jon Haidt's sloppy research.
It's always a good idea when you go to the park or the movies or even to the store to take along a friend. And when you are at the park, play in the areas that are set aside as playgrounds. Do not hang around the restrooms. And if you see any of your playmates about to get into trouble, get help from a police officer or someone you know. Just as these children did, they ran and found the little girl's mother.
So Jon Haidt has a Google document where he puts short summaries of research that he's read and that informs his way of thinking. And when it comes to abduction and parental fear, he only has 2 citations that I could find in his Google document that actually talk about, are parents really afraid of kidnapping? Why is he so focused on kidnapping? Well, because parents are scared of kidnapping. How many parents? Does he have a Pew poll or something? No, he doesn't. He bases it on a study from the year 2004 that's 20 years old at this point. And it says that children spend less time outdoors because mothers are afraid of crime, concerns about crime and safety. Another one found that from Kemple, Kenny, and Smith Bonahue, 2016, found similar things, that parents are concerned about crime and that's why they're not letting their kids outside. And in particular, they're scared about the possibility of abduction. Now, because of that, Jon Haidt has turned this into a huge issue on every podcast he goes on. But I don't know why he doesn't just go on the Pew Research Center. There was a poll done in 2023 that asked parents, below is a list of things that some parents worry might happen to their children. How worried are you about each of the following happening to your children at some point? Being kidnapped or abducted. So 11% of fathers and 21% of mothers are extremely worried that their child will be abducted at some point in their entire 17 years of childhood. Well, it seems to me the majority of people are not really that concerned. You can see from the way these categories are set up that the most common category for fathers is not too worried at all, 36%. The most common for mothers was 32%. They're somewhat worried. And then of the not worried at all, more fathers are not worried at all than they are extremely worried. So I don't know why Jon Haidt thinks this is an issue that is driving changes in parents because they're scared of abductions, they're scared of kidnapping. Every single podcast he goes on, he says that. I just don't, he's making a mountain out of a molehill. If some parents are worried about it, maybe they have a reason for being worried about it. But he's not generous enough with his opinions of parents to be able to say that. So the Pew poll also shows that dads tend to be less worried than moms about children facing kidnapping. You see here from the third row, being kidnapped or abducted. 18% of fathers are either extremely or very worried, and 35% of mothers. In other words, the majority of parents are not worried about kidnapping. That goes against Jon Haidt's thesis that parents are paranoid. The terminology that Jon Haidt uses to discuss parents is to say that they are paranoid, hysterical, and they are fetishizing safety. I consider that to be very insulting terminology and certainly not persuasive. It doesn't seem to be matching. Now, let's get into something else here. For a long time, there's been an academic and journalistic tendency to condemn the public for being too scared of crime, that they're panicky. They're panicking over crime. And you can read this in every book, every research article. I think it's an elitist, arrogant condescension to the public. And Jon Haidt jumped on the bandwagon and he chose kidnapping as his example. If you're scared of kidnapping, that means you just don't know as much as he does that kidnapping is rare. Well, Joel Best is a sociologist, I believe in Delaware. He wrote a book on this a long time ago, and he is absolutely not someone who would take up the cause of the public and defend them unless there was a good reason. And in his book, he said that there is some rhetoric about saving the children, and he calls these people claims makers. They make a claim, children are in danger, and they have different reasons for that. Some of them might be paranoid or hysterical, but some of them might have a political agenda to push. But some of them are genuinely concerned. And when he looked closely at it, what he found is that the critics, the journalists and academics who were condemning them, they were making a huge error. And this is an interesting quote from the book. Arguing that the risks of stranger abduction had been exaggerated, journalists redefined concern about missing children as a faddish hysteria, an unwitting or witless conspiracy by people in the missing children business, or a national myth. This backlash distorted what the missing children crusaders had actually said. Missing children claims makers had always argued that stranger abductions accounted for a small proportion of missing children. Stranger abductions account for a small proportion of missing children, and that's always been argued. So where do these people, why do they attack it as a witless conspiracy and a national myth? Because they're using rhetoric to make themselves sound smart. Unfortunately, I'm going to put Jon Haidt in that category because he does the same thing. I'm going to play a video for you. This is from a news report about a little girl who was taken from her bicycle by a stranger who drove away, and the police were able to save her. And I want you to answer the question, is this a kidnapping? Do you think this is a crime of kidnapping?
Good morning to you, George. This is a parent's nightmare. Police say this little girl was riding her bike on her street around 5:30 in the afternoon when she was suddenly forced into a stranger's car. That neighbor, thankfully, springing into action.
Stay right there. Stay right there.
You're watching police body camera video of the moment a 6-year-old girl was rescued from her alleged kidnapper.
Hello. It's okay. Come here. It's okay.
Police say she was riding her bike when witnesses saw a man grab her and throw her into his car.
Parks his car, middle of the road, gets out, picks up a little girl off her bike on the sidewalk, throws her bike, throws her in the passenger seat, and he just, takes off.
Neighbor Prentice Weatherford hopping in his car to pursue the suspect, only stopping when he saw a police cruiser and provided them a partial license plate number.
As I'm watching it, it felt like my stomach would just just fell. I had to do something.
Thanks to detailed descriptions of that vehicle, officers were able to locate the little girl within 10 minutes.
See your hands.
Okay, what's your exact location?
Hands.
Sergeant Joe Keeling quickly arresting 40-year-old Robbie Wild.
You feel that fear that the child probably has in them, and you want to get to them as quick as you can and remove them from this situation to try to limit the trauma to them as much as you can. And luckily, we were able to find her pretty quick.
Officer Jason Burba taking the young girl out of the passenger seat, carrying her to safety.
Well, some researchers would not include that in their definition of a kidnapping, which they call stereotypical kidnapping. So yes, a stranger abducted a kid and drove away, but it doesn't count because he only drove 2 miles. And even if he'd made it all the way back to his house with the little girl, that would have been 5.8 miles. That still would not count as a kidnapping. And you might ask yourself, how far do you have to drive in order for something to count as a kidnapping? 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles, 40 miles? No, 50 miles is the definition of stereotypical kidnapping. And I believe this is the number that Jon Haidt is citing, although he's so sloppy and he doesn't cite his sources, that I don't know where he got his number from. But so he needs to travel 50 miles with that little girl before the critics would count that as a stereotypical kidnapping. So imagine that I work in Lowell, Massachusetts. If someone kidnapped a kid and drove to Boston, it wouldn't count because it's only 32 miles. If you drive from Boston to Providence, Rhode Island, yes, that would be a kidnapping. You see how foolish that sounds? Like there's no other crime in America where there's a distance limit. If you're shoplifting, 2 feet outside the door, it's still shoplifting. If you rob a bank, you don't even have to leave the bank. It's still bank robbery. But putting a child in your car and driving away, if you stop at the 49-mile marker, it doesn't count. Well, I'm not kidding. That is actually the definition of stereotypical kidnapping. And I'll explain where it came from and why I think it's very foolish and distracting. So there is a very good criminologist. His name's Kim Rossmo, and he does what's called Journey to Crime Science. And what he found is that people usually commit crimes in places that are not immediately next to their home because they don't want to have their neighbors recognize them, but they don't want to go too far away either. There's a distance decay after a certain point because they're not familiar with other territory. They usually commit crimes in neighborhoods they're familiar with. So there's kind of a buffer zone between where they're likely to commit a crime and then where they start to feel like they're outside of their comfort area. So, for example, many studies have shown that the journey to crime is typically very short. Offenders generally commit crimes within 1 or 2 miles for their homes. So a definition of 50 miles would exclude the majority of all cases. That's why stereotypical kidnapping cannot be used as a prevalence estimate of child safety. Here's Jon Haidt on a podcast where he uses the phrase that he looked at FBI statistics when he was doing research for the book.
But when I was doing the research for the Coddling the American Mind, I found, according to FBI statistics, there's only about 100 to 150 true kidnappings a year in our whole country. Because if a child, like who would take a child? Like it's a really difficult crime and you're going to, who would steal a child from a store? Parents are afraid if your kid goes to the next aisle in the grocery store, they're going to be, how are you going to take a kicking and screaming kid out of a store?
Did he look at FBI statistics? I have my doubts. If he did look at them, he doesn't understand them. So you could go to the FBI website and look at the Crime Data Explorer under a thing called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS. And what you find is that you just go to kidnapping, that the number of kidnappings looks like it went up. But that's not the number of kidnappings in the United States. First off, that is the number of cases reported by police agencies to the FBI for NIBRS. Interesting that that's not the total number. Why is that? Because most police agencies, up until recent years, did not report at all to NIBRS. So if you look at this chart on the secondary y-axis on the right is the percentage of the population of the United States that they estimate are covered by the statistics. It's not 100%. And if you look further back, let's say the year he published this book, I think in 2016, 2017, look at the year 2015. You see that 40% of police agencies reported that there were some kidnappings, and most agencies did not make reports. So 60% of police agencies didn't report at all, and they do not extrapolate. So they don't, impute the missing data, because if big cities report and small towns don't, there's differences in the rate of kidnapping in those locations. So this is not good data. But you can look a little more detailed, and you can say, what was the ages of people who were kidnapped from the year 2000 to 2026? And you see that the victim age that was most likely to be kidnapped was 20 to 29-year-olds, then 30 to 39-year-olds, then 10 to 19-year-olds. There was 108,000 10 to 19-year-olds. The FBI doesn't do under the age of 18 as the definition of minor there. And then 0 to 9 years old is a category of 59,000. So this is a lot of kidnappings, but once again, who's kidnapping infants? Probably non-custodial parents. And Jon Haidt has said that before. He said most missing children are taken by their own parents. Well, why can't parents have their own kids? Are they abusing their kids? That's another important concern he dismisses entirely. But then you can look at the victim's relationship in this data. So boyfriends and girlfriends do an awful lot of kidnappings, 157,000. Unknown relationship. So the police don't know the relationship, or the person doesn't know. So those could be strangers, right? But some of them are explicitly labeled as strangers. 96,462 people were kidnapped by total strangers. So what I did is I downloaded the NIBRS data from the year 1992 to the year to 2022. And I wanted to know, to kind of like start deleting cases, get rid of all the adults, get rid of every category that I could. And what I found was, of people who were considered minors who were kidnapped by a stranger, specifically defined as stranger, those numbers might be what Jon Haidt was looking at. You see, it's like 176 in the year 2014. And it kind of goes up and down, but those are the number reported. If you were to try to impute or extrapolate, you would get much higher numbers, upwards of 2,150 in the year 2013. 3,292 in the year 2005. This is clearly reporting error. This is like up and down problems with generalizability. In my second chart, I included all those people who it was relationship unknown, that's potentially a stranger. Then the number could go up to be very high. But if you can't really do that, because NIBRS, the FBI specifically says that NIBRS is only including a small percentage of police agencies. So for example, in 2015, there were 6,648 agencies that represented more than 96 million Americans. But what about the other 200 million Americans? They're not represented in the data. So the number of kidnappings could be higher, could be lower, and they don't recommend generalizing. So in other words, you can't use FBI data to decide how many kidnappings there are in the United States. Jon Haidt is wrong. And I tried, even though I made those charts. He didn't make any charts. He didn't say where he got his data. He didn't say how it was analyzed. He didn't cite it and explain his methodology. He didn't even give a precise estimate. He just says roughly 100. And that indicates to me that if he was a student in one of my classes, that would be a red flag that he's just faking it. He didn't actually know how many kids are kidnapped. But there is a report he could have read that was available at the time. In 2011, David Finkelhor and his team, and remember, I have great respect for David Finkelhor, estimated that there were 105 children kidnapped by total strangers if it met the definition of stereotypical kidnapping, transporting at least 50 miles, held for ransom, abducted with intent to keep the child permanently or killed. And they have to be detained overnight. So if someone was to kidnap a child, rape them, and drop them off on a street somewhere at 2 o'clock in the morning, it doesn't count because the sun didn't rise. This definition of stereotypical kidnapping is so surprising to me. Now, I consider this to be a manipulation of the data, what we call juking the stats. So another report was done by Sedlak in 2022 that tried to measure the number of stereotypical kidnappings in the United States. She said there's 102. Well, that's pretty close to what Jon Haidt said, right? Well, they define strangers as people the child doesn't know at all. The person has to keep the child overnight. They have to admit they wanted to keep the child permanently, they kill the child or ransom the child, and they have to travel 50 miles from the abduction site. Why not 40? Why not 20? It's a very arbitrary large number that excludes the majority of all cases of kidnapping. And that's why it's juking, it's a manipulation. This excludes attempted kidnappings, children who were raped and ditched within 24 hours, children who got away, children who were rescued by the police, and murdered children whose bodies were never found, who were reported as missing or missing, we call them sometimes. And you can't trust this survey either because police are busy. You call them on the phone or send them a letter in the mail and they're not going to respond. They only surveyed 26% of police agencies and only 3.6% of the total number of agencies actually responded. So we're extrapolating our understanding of how many kids are kidnapped from 3.6% of agencies. So I would say that this falls into a category of the fallacy of exclusion. If you define kidnapping to deliberately exclude the majority of cases, you're going to end up with a small number. Then you can say that parents are paranoid over that small number that you artificially created. And I would say that this is ignoring the bigger picture. Why don't they report the total number of all kidnappings that happened within 50 miles? So I would say it would be better for Jon Haidt and everyone else if they were to report the total number of children who are sexually abused, not whether or not they were kidnapped, not if they were held overnight or taken 50 miles, but whether or not they were sexually abused. So here are some facts for you. And if Jon Haidt can't answer these, then he's a complete fraud, a complete hypocrite. As someone in the Heterodox Academy who believes in resiliency and listening to your critics, he should address this right now. Are children safe outside? He says yes, many times. Well, what about the 671,000 children sexually abused every year? What about the 277,000 who are sexually abused by an adult every year? And especially, what about the 93,176 children who are sexually abused by a complete stranger every year? That's 81 boys and 174 girls sexually assaulted by a stranger every day. But he says, don't worry about it. Roughly 100 are kidnapped every year. And taken 50 miles? No. Well, what if they're kidnapped for 20 minutes and taken 30 feet into the woods and sexually assaulted? How many of these boys and girls who are sexually assaulted every day are in danger by these total strangers? He ignores this completely. And in my opinion, that is a major flaw of his research. So he has a campaign against paranoid parenting. He says, when we overprotect children, we harm them. I don't think he's really fully demonstrated that to my satisfaction. But I do agree that there are some people who go to extreme lengths to protect their children, and it constitutes child abuse. So he gives an anecdotal case in his book about these parents who paid someone to kidnap their kid to scare the kid. I think that's child abuse, and the parents should have gone to jail. But that's such an extreme case. Why would he anecdotally choose that to represent parents? Because it's easier to say that you're fetishizing safety and you're hysterical for him to mock you and ridicule you whenever he can compare you to an extreme case. That's not science. That's a polemic. According to his website, letgrow.org, you should not teach your children about stranger danger. He thinks that children should talk to strangers, even if strangers discipline them and argue with them, because that'll teach kids how to be resilient. He thinks that children should take Halloween candy from registered sex offenders. And he thinks that children should let strangers touch their bodies in places not covered by a bathing suit. So he draws the line at the bathing suit, but he advises children to be taught to recognize that if a stranger touches you, it's not necessarily bad, as long as they're touching you in parts of the body not covered by a bathing suit. It's oddly specific for a man who's usually very sloppy. Well, I have a quote here for you. And this is very important because David Finkelhort at the University of New Hampshire has been saying for a long time that kidnapping is a bad definition of a bad measure of child safety. Here's what he said. From the beginning, much of the controversy about non-family abduction has been about definitions, not numbers. When advocates for missing children claimed that there were thousands of stranger abductions, many discriminating people found it implausible, based on their experience from the news and from their neighborhoods, because they were thinking of cases like Adam Walsh. But using a legal definition, such an incidence of abductions was not necessarily implausible. For example, the FBI in the mid-1980s reported close to 90,000 forcible rapes every year. Children, most commonly teenage girls, accounted for 1/3 to 1/2 of the cases. Because many forcible rapes may involve enough coercive movement or detention to qualify legally as abductions, it was not out of the question to think that there were thousands of legally defined abductions of children each year. And yet he doesn't think you should use kidnapping as the measure of child safety. He says, abduction is not a particularly good category for organizing or counting the criminal victimization of children. The nature and seriousness of abductions are mostly determined by the nature and severity of other crimes that are committed in their course, such as rape, assault, and murder. And in fact, these crime categories are better focal points for action on child victimization. So, in my opinion, Jon Haidt should not be counting kidnappings because of his stringent definition and because of the data collection problems and because he's obviously trying to push an agenda. But he should actually explain why he thinks the number of children sexually abused by strangers is not a big deal. I would consider him to be a fraud and a hypocrite if he cannot explain why 93,176 children estimated to be sexually abused by total strangers every year is an acceptable risk. He says roughly 100 kids are kidnapped a year. True kidnapping, traveling 50 miles. Well, does that include the 81 boys and 174 girls who are sexually assaulted by a stranger every day? He thinks it happens 100 times a year. It happens 174 times a day to girls and 81 times a day to boys. So he is wrong. I don't know how else to put it. He's wrong. By focusing on child abduction instead of all the other measures of child safety, I think that he's dangerously wrong. So I don't know if you ever read this book. It's called How to Lie with Statistics by Daryl Huff. I love this book, and I have my students read it sometimes. There's a quote in there that as soon as I read it, I always think of Jon Haidt. If you can't prove what you want to prove, demonstrate something else and pretend that they are the same thing. So what is child safety? He has to prove that children are safe. So is he going to look at the number who are raped? No. Is he going to look at the number who are victims of other crimes? No. But kidnapping, he can twist that. So if stereotypical kidnapping is the sole and only measure of child safety, it is artificially low through deliberate measurement choices. He can ignore the 93,000 children sexually abused and assaulted by strangers every year, and we can accept Haidt's statistic that roughly 100 children are kidnapped and taken 50 miles, and pretend those are the same thing. I would also say that he completely disregards the research on trauma, and he's a psychologist. This is unethical. If there was such a thing as malpractice for college professors, I think people should point this out to him. This is absurd to me that there are literally hundreds of studies. In fact, the book by Jennifer Hayes Grudo and Amanda Sheffield Morris, Adverse and Protected Childhood Experiences, cites hundreds of studies on adverse childhood experiences, and they're all associated with worse outcomes in adulthood. How does Jon Haidt, the psychologist, discuss this in his book? He dismisses it in 3 paragraphs by citing one study. He mentions sexual abuse as one adverse childhood experience. And then he says, as the number of yes responses increases beyond 2, measures of health and success in adulthood tend to decline. He never mentions sexual abuse trauma again. He doesn't say it's uniquely bad for kids, but he does mention that if you were to combine any ACE with poverty, that would be potentially damaging. He has more to say about children growing up in poverty than he does about the trauma caused by sexual abuse. I would say that Jon Haidt's emphasis on children suffering adversity and becoming resilient, the fact that they're anti-fragile, that he is always espousing, is another flawed logic. He ignores the fact that abuse is a major risk factor in suicidal behavior, drug and alcohol use, overdose, and early death. He's only counting the survivors who became resilient. So some people say that stranger danger is a myth. even though the statistics showed strangers are attacking children 93,000 times a year, sexually assaulting children. Jon Haidt claims that stranger danger is an urban myth because strangers do not commit the majority of sex crimes. So if they don't make up the majority of the offenders, then we're not allowed to be worried about it, I guess. This is a very foolish thing to say, and lots of criminologists make this mistake. So I have a rebuttal to this. And there's a book called Sex Fiends, Perverts, and Pedophiles by Chrysanthi Leon. It's all about how we stigmatize sex offenders and we're worried about strangers, and it's hysterical. The panicky public is panicked over myths. And I just think it's such condescending language to use when you're trying to describe something like this. It just shows the academic elitism again. So I have a rebuttal. Maybe if sex offenders, if strangers commit 10 to 20% of sex crimes, depending on the study and the survey, maybe we should spend a proportionate amount of our time researching it and trying to prevent it. Stranger abuse. That would be okay. So if you spend 10 to 20% of your time studying stranger abuse, that would be proportional. Maybe we can have a bigger impact on stranger perpetrated crimes than crimes that happen with acquaintances and family, because we can regulate public spaces better and supervise children more. Whereas supervising a child isn't going to protect them from their own parents. So the motivated offender is the guardian. And I would also say that 10 to 20% is not a myth. It's in fact very high. That is disproportionate to the amount of time that strangers spend with your children. So Jon Haidt admits that we don't hardly spend any time with children. Children don't spend time with strangers at all. And therefore, we should spend more time with strangers. So we don't spend very much time with them, and yet they're committing 10 to 20% of the sex crimes against children. So this means that they're predators and they're seeking children. And I wanted to read some quotes to you from Anna Salter, who's a very good psychologist. I made a whole video about her life and career. But first, I just want to read this quote. This is an interview that a sex offender gave to describe how he chooses his targets. He said, "First of all, I spot a potential victim. As I stated earlier, he must meet certain criteria. If he passes the criteria I've established, then I begin my game. I start out by saying something to him in a way to make him feel good about himself. He usually responds positively. I then put my arm around his shoulder. If the boy flinches away, I write him off as a potential victim because I know I'm wasting my time. But if he accepts my innocent hug, I continue by offering to take him somewhere. If the boy responds positively to the physical contact, he inevitably responds positively to the offer of a ball game and pizza. As I look back on it, I can see I groomed 90% of my victims. I waited for them. It was obvious they're going to come out. They would be passing by and I would have something I thought possibly they would like to see or play with or willing to. And I set them up, say hi, and then entice them with something. Later, I had abused a number of other children, picking them up in parks and playgrounds, public swimming pools, with enticements of money or rides or just anything that was going on during the time. I took them to the park. I would entice them with these things. Most of them were just one night, one-time thing, never saw them again. Now, this emphasizes that these predators are actually seeking unsupervised children. They're luring them, they're talking to them, they might even tell them their name, and the stranger then becomes an acquaintance. They don't meet the definition of stranger anymore. What does Jon Haidt say about this? What safety advice does he have for strangers? He says, stop teaching stranger danger. Stranger danger is an outdated concept and sometimes even prevents kids from asking for help when they need it. What he means is there's a possibility that if your kid is so scared of strangers, they won't go to the police for help if they get lost. I don't know of any cases where that happened. I assume it would be more anecdotal evidence from a sloppy researcher. Is there any evidence that children who are scared of strangers won't get help when they need it? Is there any evidence that stranger danger training might not be a little bit more nuanced than that? Does he think that parents are so stupid they say don't ever speak to another person ever? That they don't teach kids how to differentiate? Well, one thing you might teach your children is don't let anyone touch you. If someone touches you, get away and ask for help. Get help from someone else. Report it. Well, should you let people touch you? Well, according to that book, that pedophile predator who was hunting children, he would put his arm around them for an innocent hug. And then if they jerked away, he would write them off, that he knows he can't abuse a kid who pulls away, who's uncomfortable. What's Jon Haidt's advice? You should teach kids to recognize that no one can touch the parts of your body your bathing suit covers. And by implication, they can touch you on all the other parts of your body. So that innocent hug, helping sex offenders groom children, get to the next phase, is facilitated by Jon Haidt's safety advice. I believe this shows once again his ignorance of child safety and how sexual predators work.
Since you and I were kids, the crime rate has plummeted. It's much safer now. There's much less drunk driving. So, and child molesters, we started locking them up. We didn't used to lock them up when you and I were kids. We thought they were just eccentrics. So the physical world, the real world, is actually safer than it was 40, 50 years ago.
That's the kind of childhood you and I had, and I know that started being lost when I was a parent. It's hard to say why. I think it had something to do with drunk driving or something. No. I don't know, but nope. it was a higher safetyism component started really
paranoia. It's rising paranoia.
You know,
but we locked up all the drunk drivers. We locked up all the perverts.
Yeah,
it's much safer now. So that, yes, child predators are terrible, but guess what? We actually locked up most of them. When you and I were growing up, they weren't all locked up. They were just eccentrics who were exposing themselves. Remember flashers? That doesn't happen anymore, because if you do that now, you're going to jail for a long, long time.
Jon Haidt said something else that is completely ignorant and wrong, demonstrably wrong. He thinks that they're all locked up. Haidt has argued many times that children are safe because we locked up all the perverts. He is wrong. The majority of all sex crimes are never reported. The majority of reports do not result in a conviction. And even if convicted, they do not serve long sentences. Haidt himself admits that there are lots of people on a sex offender registry who are in the community, and they're obviously not locked up. So he himself knows this is wrong. For example, the website. So the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network has a website where they estimate that 98% of perpetrators walk free. Out of every 1,000 sexual assaults, 50 lead to an arrest, 28 lead to felony conviction, and 25 result in incarceration. I am able to back that up with data taken from the National Corrections Reporting Program, where I have data on 116,581 men who were convicted of rape in 44 states between the year 2000 and 2019. And I've estimated, compared to the National Victimization Reporting Program, and I estimated using the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey data, that 97.2% of rapes did not result in showing up in my data set. So that's pretty close to the RAIN estimate. 22% of the people in my data set were convicted but did not go to prison. They got probation. Yes, that's right, probation for rape. They were not committed to a Department of Corrections. They were released. The average sentence, the mean sentence, was 13 years, but that's the maximum sentence. So if you see someone report that a guy was sentenced to 20 years in prison, well, that's probably the maximum potential sentence. They actually served, before being released, 5.27 years. And the percent who were given a life sentence was 8%, and those were people who had multiple prior convictions. So the chance of you getting a life sentence for rape is very low. The chance of you getting probation is much higher. And on average, you serve about 5.27 years. So are all the perverts locked up? Does this data support Haidt's contention? No. Here's a visualization of the data. You can see that 22% got 0 years in prison, followed by 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. The median, meaning 50% of people in the data, served 3.8 years or less, and 50% served 3.8 years or more. What about aggravated sexual assault of a child? I found 97,395 people. I can't estimate how many. 49% were convicted but did not go to prison. They might have gotten time served for time in jail awaiting trial, and the average for that was 100 days. And that fits with probably many news reports you've heard of, people serving a couple of months in jail for sexually abusing children. The average sentence was 6.7 years, and the average amount of time served before release was 2.5 years. What about lewd sexual acts with a child, often referred to as child molestation? I got 137,528 cases. 31% were given probation. 7.31 years was the average sentence, and they served 2.7 years. So no, they're not all locked up, Jon Haidt. You're wrong. Well, what about these registered sex offenders? Once again, this is proof that they're not all locked up if they're on a registry in the community. Jon Haidt on his website says, Halloween safety myths abound, and this is one of them. Studies show that kids are no more likely to be molested on or around Halloween than any other time. Additionally, only 5% of sex crimes are committed by someone already on a registry. If you want kids to be safe, make sure they know how to cross the street. Kids are 4 times more likely to be killed by a car on Halloween than any other day. So here he is, once again, condescending, mixing his analogies. His parenting advice is always mocking your concerns. He might be right about Halloween, but he doesn't suggest this, that he says that we supervise kids too much. Well, maybe the supervision reduces sex crime victimization. He doesn't talk about that. But because then it would counteract his belief that they should not be supervised, because then the number would go up. So if every kid was let free on Halloween without any parents around, maybe there would be more abuse. Who knows? But his statistic that only 5% of sex crimes are committed by someone on a registry, he doesn't have a citation for that. Interesting. But let's pretend he's correct. Let's just pretend. Well, wouldn't that translate to an enormous risk? Registered sex offenders make up 0.2% of the population. If they're caught committing 5% of the sex crimes, that translates into 25 times greater risk of getting caught for a sex crime compared to people who aren't on the registry. I defy you to find anything in the social sciences that is associated with a change in the odds ratio of 25 times greater likelihood of an event than this. This is ridiculous. 25 times is huge risk. Every criminologist knows that the greatest indicator of future behavior is past behavior, and registered sex offenders are at an increased risk of sexually abusing all types of victims than non-registered sex offenders. Now, I do study the sex offender registry, and I have a lot of concerns about who's on it and who needs to be on it. But by his own argument, he has refuted himself. So he's not only wrong, he would prove himself wrong if he would listen to himself talk. He was on a podcast called Fair Perspectives, and the episode was titled, Why America is Uniquely Stupid. Uniquely stupid. Well, he's talking from experience. Okay, so you remember I was recommending the book How to Lie with Statistics. Let me summarize what Haidt does, especially on his website, letgrow.org, which he has partners with Lenore Skenazy, who is a very condescending and rude person who just loves the controversy of condemning all the parents in the United States. First, you downplay all threats by cherry-picking statistics and emphasizing low risks while ignoring context, such as the grooming process of sex offenders, the individual risks that your child may have because of their own personality or age or maturity level, and the neighborhood context. He doesn't talk about it at all. He focuses on one aspect of child safety, kidnapping, and completely ignores all the other measures, such as rape, sexual assault, physical assault, harassment, robbery, car accidents, and all the other stuff. He mocks parents who disagree with them by calling them names. You're stupid. You're crazy. You're paranoid. You're hysterical. You're fetishizing safety. Fetishizing safety. That is what he calls you when you want to protect your kids from these threats. And he ridicules prevention efforts. If you want to protect your kids, you want to go on social media and warn people about something, this website is full of ridicule to mock you. Now, why do I consider Jon Haidt to be sloppy? First, the goal of social science is to discover the truth about a social phenomenon, to provide a complete report of everything that you know so that your audience can make up their own mind. It is not designed to pick and choose what evidence you think supports your arguments. Jon Haidt does not present clear, testable, falsifiable arguments, and he doesn't provide details on where he gets his information. He doesn't cite his sources. He doesn't describe his methodology. This is not science at all. His mind reading, where he thinks he knows why. Why do you disagree with him? Why do you want to protect your kids? Because you watched a TV show called Adam about a kid who was kidnapped. I've never seen that show, but he can read your mind. He knows that you're hysterical and paranoid and you're fetishizing safety. The name calling is very unprofessional and unconvincing, and it's an insult to the social sciences. It's easy to take Haidt out of context because a lot of what he says is so sloppy. He'll say, well, they're all locked up. And if you show him those statistics that I just showed you, that they're not all locked up, he'll say, well, of course I didn't mean they're all locked up. Well, what did you mean? He doesn't say what he means. The worst thing about Jon Haidt, in my opinion, is he really likes to cite Nassim Nicholas Taleb in this book, Anti-Fragile. And I personally think that he's misreading Taleb's work, and Taleb is on record saying that Haidt is an idiot. So maybe that's the case. I don't know. I don't really get into that drama. But what I think that Jon Haidt should read Skin in the Game, because Jon Haidt doesn't have any skin in the game. If your child is raped, if the number of children in the United States tripled who were sexually abused, if the number who were kidnapped quadrupled, is there any threshold where he would say, oh, maybe we should protect our kids some? No, because he's a weasel. He's very sleazy. He's been able to slip his way out of accountability. He has no skin in the game when your child is sexually abused by a stranger. There's a term that's used quite a lot, and it's moral panic. And in the social sciences, I think that it is embarrassing that criminologists and sociologists and psychologists use this term, because this is it's an anti-science term. For you to create what you think is to define a moral panic, as Jon Haidt uses the phrase, is it's actually an obstruction technique. Are you worried about children being sexually abused? Do you want to investigate? Do you want to take steps to protect your kids? That's a moral panic and a witch hunt. Those are terms that are used to get you to stop, not to analyze the actual threat. Here he says in this podcast, well, if the actual threat to children was great, it wouldn't be a panic.
This was a true moral panic. That's an important word. A moral panic, they have certain properties. It spreads through the media. People read a report about something, then they get afraid. Yeah. And the definition of a moral panic includes that it's not real. If there really was a sudden wave of kidnappings by men in white vans, well, then it would be rational to fear it.
Right.
Well, what's the threshold, John? How many kids need to be sexually abused by a stranger before you would consider it to be worthy of concern? Well, there is no threshold, so there's no skin in the game. It's an unfalsifiable polemic, not a scientific statement. The purpose of statistics is to clarify, not to obscure, not to mislead, and not to make yourself sound smart. Statistics should be used to assess the prevalence of an issue, changes over time, differences between groups, estimating probabilities and risks. You have a responsibility as a social scientist to present all the relevant information so your readers can make up their own minds. He is hiding the data from you, and in a very sloppy way, writing as if he's writing a blog with no citations. It's really embarrassing. But let's do something. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Jon Haidt, let's assume he's correct about everything. He's correct about everything. All of his belief that children are safe, let's say it's true. He often makes the claim, supervision went up and crime went down. Would that justify stopping our efforts to protect children? No, it would show that protecting children works. So he's wrong about that. And for a man who so often conflates correlation and causation, it is surprising to me that he doesn't see that there could be a correlation between child protection and child safety. I would just recommend that he read a very simple theory of crime. It's not complicated, and it's absolutely one of the most robust and almost necessarily true theories of crime there is. It's called routine activity theory. And it says that if there are motivated offenders who are in contact with a suitable target, they can only be protected with capable guardianship. And we should guard our children to protect them from motivated offenders. Jon Haidt doesn't discuss that at all. Has no concern on how much protection we should have. All he's here to do is condemn your efforts to protect your children because you're fetishizing safety. Now, I don't think I'll be able to change too many minds with this. Everyone disagrees on parenting styles, and obviously, this is a big hot button issue right now, especially when you put in like the screen time issue. But a wise man once said, "You can't change people's minds by utterly refuting their arguments." And the man who said that was Jon Haidt. Jon Haidt is the perfect example of everything that he finds wrong with people's ability to engage with complicated ideas. He's not above it. He's an example of the inability of people to recognize when they're wrong. But there is one psychologist who I really admire, Anna Salter. And like I said, I made a video about her entire career. And I'm going to read you a very long quote because, in my opinion, you should try to take a reasonable approach, a nuanced, contextualized, individualized approach to protecting your own children in your own neighborhood. Don't listen to Jon Haidt. It's up to you to protect your kids. You have skin in the game. Your child is your responsibility. Well, how can you do that without becoming paranoid and going too far? Well, the greatest advice I ever read came from the book Predators by Anna Salter. She said, assume every coach, every priest, every teacher is not likely to be a sexual predator, but that one could be, and that you will not know if he is. Given that we cannot detect child molesters or rapists with any consistency, we must pay attention to the ways of deflecting any potential offenders from getting access to us or our children. Particularly, we must consider paying attention to probabilities and avoid high-risk situations. For any given situation, we must weigh the odds. I do not recommend dropping children off at sports practices and extracurricular activities if you can help it, at least not at young ages. I do not recommend sending them to an overnight with their coaches or other youth activity leaders without going along. In elementary and middle school, parents can go with their children to the school sock hop, to the community sports practices, to the games. You are not busy. You can't afford to be. This afternoon, I took my daughter to soccer practice. There were 10 8-year-old girls, 2 male coaches, and only 2 parents there. 8 years old is the average age when sexual abuse starts for girls. Only 2 parents of these girls would know if there were typical signs of grooming, if girls were being touched unnecessarily and inappropriately, if one or more of them was being singled out for special favors, if one was taken away from the rest of the group for a special time. Only 2 of us. There is a second gain from being present. A parent who is constantly attending his or her child's extracurricular activities has a less vulnerable child. They do not have a child who's easy to groom because the child is already getting attention that he or she needs. It is hard to substitute for someone who is there. Difficult to worm into a child's affections if he or she has active and involved parents. And is a signal, too, to pedophiles that you are watching. I do not find that most pedophiles are looking for a challenge. Most are looking for an easy target. And with deflection, there are choices to be made. The more we keep our children inside, the more we limit their contact with the outside world, the less likely it is they will be molested. At the extreme, we could homeschool, keep our children away from all group sports and activities, and never let them go anywhere without escorting them. We might keep them safe from molestation, but few of us would think our children would benefit from such a cloistered childhood with so few opportunities for growth. On the other hand, we could simply sign up for anything, assume anyone who has a ready smile is a good person, and send them off for overnights with any group that seems reputable. This is more the pattern in this country, but it too yields a fearful toll. As I've shown, even reputable groups are easily infiltrated by pedophiles, and the result, as we've seen earlier, is that a minimum of 20% of girls and 10% of boys in the United States are finding their ways into the hands of child molesters. This is a slider, this business of protecting our children. On the one extreme, there would be few opportunities for our children, but few opportunities for pedophiles as well. On the other extreme, there would be many opportunities for our children and many also for child molesters. Where you set the slider will determine how many opportunities your children have and how many molesters have. Most of us want to be thoughtful about this, and we do not want to be somewhere in the middle. We do not want to deprive our children of everything in an effort to make them safe, but we also don't want to take risks with our children if we can accomplish the same thing with less risk. We don't want either extreme, no supervision or no opportunities. Each parent's decisions on these matters is a personal one. No book could or should try to make those choices for you. This book is simply a map of the terrain so that you can make those decisions knowing who the enemy is, how he thinks, and where he hides. As for my decisions, look for me at the basketball practice, on the soccer field, at Little League. I'm the woman sitting over there on the lawn chair with the baseball cap, the one at every practice, every game. I'm the one volunteering to help chaperone the overnights. I'm the parent whose children are in day camp, not overnight. If I do my job right, my children's lives will be filled with so many opportunities and interests, they will not even notice what they're missing. The only one who will notice is that friendly, smiling, affable man with a secret life, the one who's waiting for an opportunity that will never come. In my opinion, that is some great common sense advice from an expert who recognizes potential risks. We take precautions to prevent rare events all the time. That's why they're rare. I don't think we're taking enough precautions to prevent these extremely prevalent scourge of child sexual abuse. Scourge is the word used by David Finkelhor when he estimated that 93,000 children are sexually abused by strangers every year. That is because we're not supervising enough in the right context and circumstances. There is a balance between irrational panic and common sense child protection. Jon Haidt wants to take it into a further extreme of letting children be free range and easy pickings. Condescending ridicule of parental concern by academics is an insult to the victims of crime, and the manipulation of statistics needed to try to prove that parents are moral panickers and fetishizing safety is an insult to honest social scientists. No wonder we don't have any credibility. The grooming process turns strangers into acquaintances before the abuse starts. So yes, we should focus on strangers, but there's also a process there that we need to teach kids about. You should protect your children from strangers, but remember to teach them about the dangers posed by people in their circle of trust, basketball coaches, school teachers, even nurses. There's been a string of abuses in New Hampshire lately from nurses sexually abusing children in the hospital. It happens. Just because you're in an organization doesn't mean that an agency, a business, doesn't mean that your kid is safe. We have to do a lot of things, but it's not easy. And you definitely shouldn't be summarily dismissed by someone like Jon Haidt. If you have any questions, you want further information about this and the statistics I provided, you can email me at this address, and I'd be glad to provide you with more information. Stay safe, and thank you very much.